Good evening, good afternoon. It's Saturday, March 26th. So I'm going to talk about units of measure as applies to someone who works in a small studio. Okay, my studio, as you see behind me, is, 12 feet by 10 feet. Obviously, I'm not getting a tape measure out to be certain. And that's what I want to get to here, is that there are things that we do that are subject to being measured, but not necessarily subject to tape measure measurements. So, for instance, in grad school, I discovered handily that the distance from the there to there was exactly 9 inches, or close enough to 9 inches, that when I was loading a kiln, 9 inches is the length of a brick, a standard brick, and so when we were spacing things out for loading a kiln, I could say this was a post, or 9-inch post, and I could measure pots and see what was going to fit. Okay, in this case, the idea of talking about measurement came up because I'm currently sort of in the middle of 3 or 4 different phases in my production. And I was getting excited about doing some throwing, but then I realized I didn't have the space to put fresh pots, because what I have is, you can see behind me, you can see that set of shelves. Well, that's on wheels, and that's a total of 7. And what it holds are these shelves. Okay, so what is that? 9, 10, 11, 18. So 24 by what they call, so these are like 1 by 12s. Okay, these are my standard shelves. When I was younger, stronger, more vigorous, I had longer shelves, which was sadder if a whole shelf fell over. And they were also heavier to pick up and carry around and move through the building and so forth and so on. So I've come with these, and they work out fine. But as you can see from back there, I only have space for 7 of them on that rack, maybe a couple of other spaces around. And so what I have to be clear about is, what am I about to do, and how am I going to get those pots moved around the building, because my kiln is upstairs in the garage. And I don't want to create a situation in which I'm so crowded that I can't move without breaking something. Okay, so I was going to throw some pots. I may tomorrow. But first, I have a kiln load of bisque that has to be unloaded and conceivably glazed and reloaded and fired. And I want to use shelves to do this. For those of you who are working out your studio, okay, just as sort of an aside, these are just plain pine boards. And yes, there will be a certain amount of warpage here when they get wet, but then they flatten out again. And I like the fact that they're smooth. I've made similar sized ones in plywood, and they're less likely to warp this way and more likely to warp this way. But they're also rougher, and I haven't bothered to sand them, which means if I'm not careful, I've, for instance, just trimmed a pot, I set it on there, and then later there's a texture on the foot ring that wasn't planned. So I'm not advocating necessarily hardcore for this as a solution for your shelves. I'm just letting you know this is my solution. Okay. That warp in the board isn't really a problem unless I have a really wide object. Okay. If I have a mug, the mug is not being really affected by the fact that the board has a little arc to it. So, okay. So I'm having to be restrained. I know this is an unusual concept for some of us. I have to get through the unloading of the kiln, the glazing, the reloading, before I can move on to the other things. And I know that, not because I measured anything with a tape measure, but because I measure my life in Ware boards. And I know how many I have, and for just that many. And they can't do two jobs at the same time. Anyway, oddly specific, but topical, at least for me, this weekend. Have a good evening.